another issue that we can't contend with. And one of those might be, well, imagine that in order for society to progress, you have to allow the individual to compete in a relatively untrammeled space so that they can innovate. And then imagine that one of the consequences of that innovation is that you get these Pareto distributions developing because the innovator or the one who's second in line to the innovator, whatever, ends up with the bulk of the spoils. So you might say there's a cost to be paid in inequality for innovation. And then you could also say, well, too much inequality destabilizes things, which seems to be quite clear. So there's room for an intelligent conversation about that, right? Because the lefties say, too much inequality. And they need to be listened to because the evidence is quite clear. If you let the inequality ramp up enough, the whole system destabilizes because the people at the bottom think, fuck it, we'll just flip the system upside down.
Right.
No one wants that. Like right-wing conservatives don't want that. So because you could make a Republican argument and say, don't let the inequality in your neighborhood get out of hand because the crime rate will skyrocket. And the empirical evidence on that is overwhelmingly strong. Inequality drives crime. Now you can argue about why, but the fact that it does that's not disputable. So we could have an intelligent discussion between the left and the right, and the discussion would go something like this. You need innovation, you pay for innovation with inequality. But you need to bind inequality because if it's too intense, then things destabilize. It's like, okay, we could agree on that. We've got the parameters set. Now we have to start thinking very carefully through how to do the redistribution issue, and we don't know how to do that. So you might say, well, we have a guaranteed annual income for people, which I think is a horrible solution, by the way, but it addresses the right problem. The problem is that we're hyperproductive, but the spoils go to those at the top. And some of those resources need to be funneled down to the people who have zero so that they have an opportunity to at least get to the point where they can innovate, and so the whole bloody thing doesn't wobble and fall. And and I would say in some sense that's what the political discussion is about. But we've skittered off into these radical oversimplifications, which is something like, well, if you have more than another person, you're an oppressor and you're evil. And if you have less, it's because you're virtuous and victimized. And that's just a non-starter.
So you think that there's a real problem with like something like a universal basic income? You think it's a horrible idea?
Well, I think the idea that the solution is a basic income is not a good idea, because I think the problem is deeper than that. I don't think the fundamental problem is that people don't have enough money. I think the fundamental problem is that human beings in some sense are beasts of burden. And if they're not provided with a place where they can accept social responsibility, social and individual responsibility in an honorable manner, they degenerate and die. That's the opiate crisis in the West right now. Like men who are men don't need money. They need function. And we've got a problem. One of the problems is, for example, here's an ugly stat. I think I told you this once before. It's illegal to induct anyone into the armed forces if they have an IQ of less than 83. And the reason for that is the armed forces, despite having every reason to draw the contradictory conclusion, has decided that there isn't a single thing that you can be trained to do in the military if you have an IQ of less than 83 that isn't positively counterproductive. That's 10% of the population. And we're producing a culture that's very cognitively complex. Like, what the hell are you going to do if you can't use a computer? Like, if you can use a computer, you're at least in the game. If you can really use one, you're hyper powerful. If you're not literate enough to use a computer, you're at zero. 10% of the population. The conservatives say, well, there's a job for everyone if they just worked hard enough. It's like, no, and increasingly no. And the liberals say, well, everyone's basically the same and you can train anyone to do anything. It's like, no, you can't.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the inequality point here, because if you look at this biologically, actually, I think it reveals a lot. Why are we know from careful study that people are motivated by the degree of inequality more than they are the absolute level of well-being that they have. And there's a very good, it's tragic, but a very good evolutionary reason for this, which is if you are working on some piece of land and your neighbor has the adjacent piece of land and they're doing twice as well as you, it's because they know something you don't. Right? And so becoming focused on what they're doing that you're not doing is a rational thing to spend your time on, so you can figure out what it is that they know that you don't. In the modern environment, this is a catastrophe, because who are your neighbors? Well, you've got some box sitting on the wall of your living room that has a totally artificial portrait of other people who may be much wealthier than you, and it's broadcasting in as if you're looking in their window, right, in the adjacent house. And so you think, you're being triggered to think that you're doing something wrong that you might fix, when in fact the solution may not be, first of all, the person on the other side of that screen may not be for real,
Right.
but even if they are, they're not living in the same environment as you. The technology is interfacing with our brains badly. But so we have the perception of massive inequality. Economically, we do have massive inequality. You're arguing that the solution to this involves some sort of massive redistribution.
Well, as solution. I wouldn't
A
argue,
solution. But nonetheless, redistribution is wildly unpopular for various reasons. And so what we've got now is a situation, this is speculative, but what's really happening is that austerity is being used as a threat to keep people who would otherwise rebel against the inequality in line. And my fear about this is that this is exactly the conditions that are going to trigger that tribal population against population mayhem that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. That when people have the sense that the burst of growth that they were experiencing is now over, the natural response is to turn on those who are not as powerful and take their stuff. That this is a totally indefensible but nonetheless biological pattern of history. And that if we want to avoid that, we have to stop sending the signals that trigger us to imagine that we've just run to the limit of the opportunity that we had discovered, and it is now time to look and see who can't defend their position.
How are we sending these signals?
Well, by basically failing to provide enough well-being that people's perception of the inequality is reduced to a tolerable level.
That's the
you do
argument for universal basic income,
It's
right?
certainly a strong one, and you know.
It's also a good argument for equality of opportunity, right? Because people are actually not as resentful about the success of others as you might expect. They're resentful about it if they feel that the game is fixed. But they're also willing to consider the game long term. So lots of people will say, look, like, I'm stuck at not 0, I'm stuck at 1. But my kids might make it to 4, and that's good enough. And that's been the American dream, right? And that's a really high power antidote to inequality. It's like, well, yeah, there's some inequality. We need it to keep the generative mechanism going, but the game is fair and you can play it too, and there's some reasonable probability that either you or someone you love will be successful. So so it has to be a straight game, and that's why ethics is so important to keep this landscape stable. People can't play crooked games, and the rich shouldn't be fixing the game if they want to hold on to their money. And the problem is that some of them, although not all, some of them are fixing the game, and no one's happy about that, and no wonder, you know. And I guess that was evidenced to some degree by the 2008 collapse, because it seemed, and I'm just as uninformed as the next person, so I'm capable of commenting on this. It seems from the outside that the rich disproportionately benefited from the restabilization of the economic system. And people are not happy about that. And they shouldn't be happy about that, because it indicates that there's something fundamentally rotten about the game. So you could say, well, maybe people can tolerate necessary inequality if the game isn't rigged. And so that's why everybody has to act in a manner that indicates that the game isn't rigged. And that means they can't rig it. That's really what it means.